They realize that really God is the only doer. And then this is the next thing I'll talk about, is how God is the only doer. And so what I mean by God's the only doer is that literally the only thing, I've said this many different times, but like literally God is doing everything. God is the only thing that's doing anything. And so there's a way to be able to experience peace inside of yourself where you start to literally give up yourself as being the doer, and then all of a sudden any faults or negative experiences or actions or anything like that, all of that is taken away from you. And it's not like you may not make quote unquote mistakes from the outside, but the thing is that like those faults are no longer you. They're not you who's doing that. It's just, you're just being the person who's experiencing that. And like God is the one who's doing these things in order to just show you all the things that you've identified with throughout all these different experiences. And then once you start disidentifying from those things, then all of a sudden the negative experience that comes from the results of your actions is no longer negative to you, because you realize that God is the only one doing it. So really God is experiencing the negativity. So it's hard to describe, because like God doesn't think of positive and negative like we do. Like God understands that all things are positive, all things are good, all things are perfect, because God is doing everything perfectly. So if you start to see everything that you're doing as God's doing, then everything that you're doing becomes perfect, no matter if it's perfect to you or not. And so you become the non-doer because you realize that you're not the one doing it. It's like God is the only one doing anything. And that comes with like a really massive level of peace and comfort and happiness on the inside. You become really content with everything, because you start to see that as long as you give this desire that you have for the fruit of your action to God, then He can give you what is necessary for your consciousness to be cleansed in order for you to be able to see the ultimate truth of everything. And then once you start to see the ultimate truth of everything, then what happens is that you start to be able to accept everything as it is, because you start to see why everything has happened as it's happened, and you start to see in yourself all of the reactions that you've had that have caused all of the negative things to happen, and how all of those negative things were actually not negative in the first place. You just thought that they were because you had some sort of outcome dependency inside of your consciousness at that moment. So once your consciousness becomes cleansed of that, then all of a sudden there's no longer a desire for any kind of particular outcome, because all outcomes are good to you, because they're all perfect. They're all God's will. And so you start to become really content and happy with everything, because of the fact that you realize that there's no reason to worry about anything. There's no reason to have any kind of negative feelings inside of yourself. Even if something crazy happens or whatever, it's like, what is worrying about going to do? What is kind of going in your consciousness and being like, oh, this shouldn't have happened and all this other stuff, all that stuff, literally all it does is just cause you suffering and pain inside of yourself. And it literally disconnects you from being able to experience bliss. And so like for me, I started to realize that God is the only thing that matters. The only thing in this lifetime is to learn how to accept everything as God's will, because that's the only thing that's going to bring you peace and happiness inside of yourself. Everything else is just a distraction, and all it does is just elongate the suffering. So literally, it's best to just figure out a way to be able to surrender everything to God, so that you can actually experience this life as being what it was supposed to be, rather than what you project onto it. And once you surrender everything to God, then everything becomes blissful, literally. Then to the degree that you're not surrendered to God is the degree that everything is not blissful. So that's how you can figure out how much you're actually surrendered onto God, is that if you're not blissful all the time, then you're not surrendered onto God all the time. If you are blissful all the time, then generally you're probably surrendered to God in some sort of way. And then if you're extremely blissful all the time, then pretty much all of yourself is surrendered at that moment to God. So it's like literally the whole purpose of life is to literally give ourselves as servants to God. And the whole purpose of life is to be able to experience God in this body, as this consciousness, as God doing everything through us. That's what the purpose of life is, for us to go back to God. They call it Godhead. They like to go back to Godhead. The only way to go back to Godhead is to not be a person. You have to be a part of God, which is a servant of God, also being God at the same time. So it's like God and his devotees are the same. Like, they may be a devotee of God, but as Hanuman says, like, when I know who I am, we are one. When I don't know who I am your servant. So really, like, the whole thing is that it's all about letting go of all of these aspects that you think are you inside of yourself, and then starting to realize that when you give these things up, first of all, you don't lose anything. You don't actually lose anything. You gain awareness, you gain understanding, and you actually still have all of those aspects of yourself that you gave up. You just don't identify with them anymore. I used to think that when I would surrender everything, that I would no longer be here experiencing it. Like, I would be completely like, and no, all that's just fear from the ego. Literally, when you don't have an ego, everything's the same, except you just don't have suffering anymore. And like, you don't identify with yourself anymore. So it's like, the only thing that you're giving up is identity. It's not even a real thing. It's all just illusion that you have in your consciousness that you're trying to give up to God. And it's like, once you give up all that illusory identification that you have inside of yourself, then it's replaced with a sense of pure bliss and happiness inside of yourself, because of the fact that you don't have anything else that clings on to the sadness. Because the only thing that can be sad is an ego. And when there's no ego there, then there's no way to be sad, because there's nobody to be sad. The only one there is God, and God is never sad. God is always blissful. So the whole point of this whole thing is just to replace as many different portions of yourself with God as you possibly can, and whatever you can't, you ask for God to be able to do that for you, and you genuinely give yourself up in order to let go of your suffering. Otherwise, you will be suffering all the time. Meaning, like, literally, like the ego in the human body is suffering. So literally, unless you love suffering, then you're not going to love your life that much, because of the fact, I mean, you may love pleasure, but then once you love pleasure, you have to love pain too, you know. So it's all linked together. So it's best to just go beyond pleasure and pain, beyond the body, beyond the mind, beyond all these other things, and just give it all to God and experience yourself as being that perfect soul that is just observing all of these different things happening inside of yourself. To experience yourself as being the portion of God that you actually are, the being that you actually are as one with God. To go beyond suffering, because suffering is dependent on a body and a mind experiencing suffering. Like, there has to be somebody there to experience suffering. So give your somebodyness to God, and you won't go away, you won't disappear. You won't, all these things that your mind would think, like, oh, if I give myself to God fully, then all of a sudden I'm not going to be here to experience anything. It's like, no, you actually will be fully here, because you never were that in the first place. That ego was never you. It was just a delusion that you have in your mind. And everybody's going to die eventually. So it's like, eventually you're going to have to give up the body anyways. You're going to have to give up the mind anyways. So why would you wait until the end of your life, where you're going to cling on and fear, and then get pulled into this illusion of fear and suffering, and then be pulled out of your body in that state of fear and suffering, and then experience that eternally, which is not actually eternal in the sense of like never ending. Eternally means beyond time. So when you die in fear, then all of a sudden you're experiencing fear eternally. And then you get born into a body, and then you experience time again, and then you go back into that whole cycle. So it's not, infinity implies infinity is beyond time, it's beyond space. So when the feelings of time and space dissolve inside of yourself, then all of a sudden the experience of an infinite consciousness is basically like whatever you're being right now is what you are in a sense, but not. Like, when the ego dissolves, the only thing that's left is perception. But if there's something left there clinging on to that perception and having some sort of projection onto it, then when the body is no longer there as a filter, that projection will just project itself, and that projection will be eternal. And not eternal, like eternal is the wrong word, but it'll be timeless. So it feels as though it's forever and no time at all at the same time. And a lot of times, if that happens ever, it's more like a dream, where people, like when you're dreaming, you could just flip from one scene to another scene just over and over again and not be even conscious of it. Like you could be, at one moment you could be sitting right here, and then another moment you could be all the way across the world, and then another moment you could be running away from something, and then another moment you could be embracing something. And it's like non-linear at all. It's just like whatever comes up in the consciousness just appears. And so you just want, when being in that kind of a state, you want to be able to be solidly in a state of bliss consciousness, so that you can experience a timeless state of bliss. That's basically like what it is. But like, there are also other realms of existence, and there are also other realms that you can go to after death. But like, the whole point that I'm making is that, like, this was a ramble, but like, meditation, bringing the mind to a point, it's basically all about surrendering yourself to God. It's about giving yourself. And by yourself, what I mean is your identification with the body, the mind, and the doings and the fruits of your actions. It's about giving all of that to God. And then once you truly surrender that to God, it will be replaced in your consciousness by a state of peace, joy, serenity, comfort, happiness. Give all your pleasures to God too. So sacrifice all of these